Imagine politicians that don't gesture, that have their hands and arms rigidly by their bodies. You would find that very strange. You would find them not only stiff but also uncommunicative. Most of the gestures that you see politicians make serve two main purposes. One is simply to emphasize a point.
Still a force for freedom and peace and democracy at home and around the world. I am convinced more than ever in my life that the best days of this country are still ahead of us.
The other aspect is that with the change in the hand shape or in the motion pattern, units of speech are marked off.
To work through the details of it and make sure
A new unit of speech begins with a new hand shape or a new motion pattern. So in effect, the viewer knows how to structure what he or she is hearing from watching the gestural motions.
And we've got the chance over
But there are also a number of more specific gestures or gestures that have more specific meanings. To this day, politicians are very fond of making the gesture of the precision grip, which was already described in ancient Rome in politicians during that time. It suggests that what's being said right now is something very specific, right? You pick out a specific object that you're talking about, or you say something very specific about that object. A very common kind of gesture that you find among politicians simply uses kind of chopping motion, a kind of slicing motion, which is then made with a variety of different hand shapes. The precision grip, an extended pointing index finger, a flat hand, which kind of emphasizes the slicing motion, and so on.
It's a critical national security issue for our future, and politics must stop at the schoolhouse door.
It's important that you look at the context in which the gesture is made and not believe that there is a fixed meaning to the particular gesture.
En sentimiento, y por tanto se puede hablar de solidaridad.
You do sometimes find politicians making iconic gestures, as, for example, George W. Bush putting his hands as if he is strangulating something while he says the grip of terror.
Slowly but surely, the grip of terror around the throats of the Iraqi people is being loosened.
Another way of thinking about this gesture is to think about it as a metaphor, because the word grip of terror, of course, is a metaphor, and so the gesture emphasizes that metaphorical quality of his talk. Among radical, populist political leaders, you often find a body language that kind of runs against the established norms. So by performing in an outrageous kind of manner, they seek to appeal to the masses that are fed up with the established political system. A good example of that is Mussolini, who in this segment not only uses sort of a very theatrical body motion, but also explains his concepts by gesture in a way that is very uncommon among established politicians. A part of bodily behavior that we don't usually think much about is how people walk. And it seems that in ancient Rome, there was a class of politicians gaining in influence during the Republic, and they came from the provinces, from the country. And they had a very different style of moving than the urban elite of Rome. And so they embodied their politics by walking in what used to be called a rustic kind of way. Tendency to moderate gesture has a lot to do with the way the human body is seen in Western culture. Christianity plays a part in that. And so, for example, during the Middle Ages, when somebody gestured exuberantly, that was seen as a sign that the person was unable to control his or her bodily urges. To this day, the proscription against all too expressive gestures is motivated by the idea that there is a lack of self-control in the speaker. Whereas, as a communication scholar, I would say the more you gesture and the more complex your gestures are, the more you actually communicate with your audience. I think we're experiencing a real renaissance of gesture, and I think that this may have something to do with the visual nature of today's society.
Give me a break. This whole thing is the biggest fairy tale I've ever seen.
While the emotions, intent, and expressiveness of our political leaders can be recognized in their facial expressions and body language, their ability to convince us is also highly dependent on voice quality and intonation.
Down the tensions that have risen there.
To believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
The voice is linked to the way in which we communicate with each other and the world, which is not only a scientific, but also a psychological point of view. The voice is linked to the speaker's intent, and the speaker's intent can be heard by listening to the tone of voice.
En écoutant le timbre de la voix.
Ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Because in the end, the voice represents the balance between the outside and the inside, between our thoughts and the expression of those thoughts. There are several different voice types. Firstly, the head voices, which are characterized by a direction, especially the direction of the face. Head voices make one appear important, often trying to be convincing. We then have one voice similar to the head voice, the oral voice, that puts into play the buccal cavity. For example, Tony Blair has a voice in which the mouth is active, giving the voice a sharp quality, the voice putting out treble harmonics with a forceful effect.
Britain has learnt that lesson many times before in our history.
Another example of oral voice is that of Bill Clinton, who doesn't really have a deep resonating voice, or chest voice. His voice is rather high-pitched, so it can be considered an oral voice with a relatively nasal quality.
Our adversaries can become our allies. At the special NATO summit this summer, that is what we will begin to do. We must strengthen NATO's partnership for peace with non-member allies.
We also have voices that emanate from the larynx, called throat voices. These voices are voices that are tight in the throat. They indicate a search for words, where the word takes precedence over resonance. And so these voices are always less charismatic than resonating voices. Voices that can make us feel especially ill at ease are those which use the throat in particular and emanate predominantly from the head. The voice is not using the body as a whole and is disturbing because it's throaty and stuck in the throat, as for former German Foreign Minister, Mr. Fischer.
And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced.
You promise a meeting at that high a level before you know what the intentions are. I don't want to be used for propaganda purposes.
Hillary Clinton is someone whose voice is falsely self-assured. Her voice reveals a certain fragility, and its register is more from the larynx and head.
In front of the most valuable icon in our history.
You couldn't say that Hillary Clinton has a chest voice that is seductive or affirmative, as for Margaret Thatcher.
Together our nations have faced the challenges of our time and have not flinched. We forged ahead with strengthening the peace, spreading prosperity, and safeguarding liberty.
Hillary Clinton plays on the emotional register for the very reason that the lack of assurance in her voice allows this emotional fragility to be heard without any attempt to disguise it.
Step on a long journey throughout the country as we put our cases forward.
The stomach voices are the most valued voices because they provide a solid bass and abundant treble harmonics. It's a voice you find in particular in Ronald Reagan, who had a good balance between bass and treble. He not only had a very sustaining voice, but a stomach voice that brought everything into play and gave him a balanced voice which was extremely harmonious.
The exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. To those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty. We will strive.
Another important element of the efficiency of vocal messages is the number of words per minute.
Money cannot buy it. Power cannot compel it. Technology cannot create it. It can only come from the human spirit.
Even if there are cultural differences between languages, tests have been done showing that usually the right pace is between 140 and 180 words per minute. Under 140, the attention of the audience is decreasing and a feeling of boredom develops. Over 180, the flow of words is too big and the message becomes unclear.
The United States respects rule of law. But in the debate on migration,
pauses in a speech are also very important, although there are sometimes pauses marking hesitation and uncertainty.
Or how we used our intelligence to, for example...
But most of the time, pauses are there to mark authority, emphasis, or solemnity.
Friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
I think usually you find a lot of coherence or consistency in the different communicative media that we use in everyday communication, meaning gaze, gesture, body posture, and speech. They go together actually in very subtle, very intricate ways. But every so often you find that there's a discrepancy between somebody's, let's say, facial expression and the content of what the person is saying. I think the American President Bush is an example of that. You often find him showing a facial expression that does not seem to congruent with the content of his speech. One thing that is striking about the facial expression of George W. Bush is its asymmetry, and you can see that asymmetry especially clearly in his eyebrows. When he uses his eyebrows, he raises his eyebrows to convey emphasis. They often end up in different positions, one being higher than the other, and that makes his face look as if he finds what he's saying funny. People have a very difficult time interpreting that.
Well, but what wasn't wrong was the fact that he had the ability to make a weapon.
So the asymmetry of Bush's face is also visible in the mouth. His mouth is diagonal and his face is longer on one side and shorter on the other. It is crooked, as we say.
This is all in the context of war.
Coherence usually comes naturally. But when there's a lack of coherence, somebody needs help.
Growing up, she gave me love and lots of advice. I gave her white hair.
The public can, of course, sense at its emotional levels whether they are seeing a strong, self-confident behavior or a behavior which is, to some degree, acting strong without really having that inner strength just subconsciously.